Hi everyone, thanks again for joining this last session of the day. This session is called Beyond Sustainability, a Just Transition and Regenerative Economies. We are going to listen to 5 really interesting speakers to have a broader idea on how we can collectively embrace a just transition from an extractive economy, looking beyond sustainability towards regeneration. We will also learn how different stakeholders can influence this shift and play a major role in it. The format is going to be the following. We will hear each speaker for about 15 minutes after introducing each one of them. The format will be kind of similar to a tech talk format. They will tell us about their work, the systems they think that need to change from their perspective, and what opportunities there are to achieve collective action. This is an incredible opportunity for every one of us to understand and compare different visions of a just transition, the concept of regenerative environment, and how collective action can be put into practice to achieve all these objectives.
Thanks, Ron. And for our first speakers of the day, they actually pre-recorded their speech because they're in Alaska and wanted to make sure that there wasn't going to be any issues with their connection. And they're going to be talking about how to apply a just transition framework and to build regenerative economies like Raul was just talking about in Alaska. And those two folks are Ruth Miller, who's a Diana Athabaskan, an Ashkenazi Russian Jewish woman raised in Dagaya, Anchorage, Alaska. Ruth is the Climate Justice Director for Native Movement, a matriarchal grassroots indigenous organization that fights for the rights of indigenous peoples, their lands and waters, and justice for their ancestors and descendants. She is a member of the Kuriyoung tribe of Dillingham and Bristol Bay. And I should have apologized ahead of time for my terrible pronunciation, but I'll do that now. And then our second speaker will be Margie Dyshevsky. She's a lifelong Alaskan who is descended from white settler colonizers and is committed to Black and Indigenous land justice, reconciliation, and reparations. Margie is the Regenerative Economies Coordinator for Native Movement and Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition. So now we're going to play that video as they talk through sort of a just transition and regenerative economies in Alaska.
Yachlidu Shavak is Ruth Miller Gustanish Iji. Then in Kanagashaskum Kanash or Chachang Aslanish ite, she does not Heather Kindle Miller Shimtat or Miller Stuktat or occasionally Veneshakayaki Landa, Chickenek Kaliki Diki, Yetel Hanud Bagut Yachliat Sette. My English name is Ruth Miller, and my Deni Athabasca name is Shavaik Isan. My family is from Pichon, Vena, the Lake Clark area, but I'm so happy to be calling in today from my Deni homelands here in Dachayakak in Anchorage, Alaska, alongside my wonderful colleague, Margie Dyshevsky. We are so proud to be representing Native Movement, the Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition, and the Just Transition Collective as we speak with you today. I am the Climate Justice Director for Native Movement, and I am so happy to be leading a majority of our climate and just transition work and to be sharing this space with you as we explore what regenerative economy might mean for an Alaska's future.
Thank you, Ruth, so much. My name is Margie Dyshevsky. I am the Regenerative Economies Coordinator for Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition and Native Movement. And I am calling in from the lands of the Dena'ina people in Anchorage and grew up in Fairbanks in the lands of the Lower Tanana Dene. My parents, a botanist and a geologist, came to Alaska for summer work, and one thing led to another, and we're still here. And I descend from Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants and white settler colonizers. And this work of just transition and specifically regenerative economies is really near and dear to my heart because I really see it as a confluence of both the greatest threats as well as the greatest opportunities facing people alive today. So before we dive into our visions for how Alaska can transition in a just way off of fossil fuels to a regenerative future, I do want to speak to the realities of what it's like to live in a resource colony. In many ways, this natural resource extraction is seen as the past, present, and future of Alaska, and we know that's not true, but it's a hard story to shift. And so there's a lot of conservative politics and political impasse, but a strength that Alaska really has is the tremendous tribal sovereignty that exists here. There are over 231 tribes. That's just the number of federally recognized tribes. And there are more than 27 Alaska Native languages that are spoken here. And unlike the rest of the lower 48, as we say, there aren't very many reservations here. Instead, what the government set up is a complex system of regional and local Alaska Native corporations. And so these different tribal entities have different ownership of, for example, surface and subsurface rights. And so to give one example of how this plays out in practice, in the case of natural resource extraction, is that for example, the regional corporations are the ones who own the subsurface rights, and that can pit community members against each other and incentivize different stances around these issues. So that is all occurring. Meanwhile, our frontline communities are experiencing the worst impacts of climate change. And those are also oftentimes, not coincidentally, the communities that are most dependent on the jobs from resource extraction. And so being able to show how Alaskans can not just meet our basic needs, but actually bring forth an even more prosperous economy than what we currently have is exactly what we're about. And so using justice-informed approaches to revitalize our economy, respond to the pandemic, and mitigate and adapt to climate change is vital. I'll pass to Ruth to share more about how we're doing that.
And so Margie did such a great job of setting the stage a bit for the how of what we're dealing with now. But we also have to consider the why. Alaska's colonization is actually relatively recent. We're just talking 1 to 2 generations ago, when our peoples were still living nomadically, moving from spring camp to summer camp to fall camp to winter camp, when our indigenous languages were thriving, and when our economies were based on reciprocity and care, and our sovereign governments were representational and were just. So now when we consider what a just transition means, we have to be willing to investigate the root causes and the harms done, the traumas inflicted on our peoples, so that we can chart a pathway forward that learns our lessons from the past, that carries forth our ancestral wisdom, as we also support the new technologies and new industries of today. So when we speak of just transition in Alaska, I'd like to share a bit of a diagram, which in the Benti Kanaga language of the Lower Tanana Dene means remembering forward, or we remember. For Indigenous peoples, just transition is not new. It is a practice of returning to relationships of reciprocity, care, and sustainability that guided our peoples successfully for millennia until the very recent past. It is often forgotten that Indigenous communities had and continue to have now advanced place-based technology, encyclopedic scientific knowledges, complex social structures, and effective sovereign governance. When we envision our next sustainable economy, it's more so a matter of disempowering the colonial mindsets and their industries that have desecrated our lands and harmed our people, as we return to a balance that our ancestors might recognize. We can build off of this movement generation diagram by investigating at first the extractive economy and its process towards a regenerative economy. Again, in our work as Alaskan community organizers, we know we need to Alaskanize this framework a bit. This map intends to show the interconnectedness of the injustices at hand, as well as the intertwining ways that we might heal together. Starting on the left here, in an extractive economy, or particularly in the late stage capitalism that this country pursues, resources here are extracted in a dig, burn, dump cycle that has no regard for human or an environmental health and well-being. Work is exploited from laborers through low-paying, low-quality, low-rights jobs for the purpose of enclosing wealth and power in the elite few. Governance is enforced through militarism, which is the most funded sector in the US government and one of the world's leading greenhouse gas emitters, and through the prison industrial complex. And to protect itself, worldviews of consumerism and a coloniality are forced through unregulated industry, mandatory public schooling, and policy that disempowers global majority voices. We might also add to this map the inhumane and unjust principles that founded this country on racism, genocide, and disregard for the natural world. We know that colonization caused climate change, and it is important to similarly expand on the ways that the ongoing process of colonization means that colonial minds see towards justice. In the middle of this graph, we understand that we must support solutions that are not just crumbs from the table, but which are visionary and oppositional to the principles of this first worldview. We must stop the bad, change the rules, and build the new. This graph prompts us to starve and stop the abusers of power and implement a values filter and indigenous-led values filter that benefits from millennia of knowledge and relationship with the lands of this country as we feed and grow new solutions and communities of care. By drawing down power into local communities, we will finally begin to see representational politics and get needs met on the ground. The right side of this map illustrates shift towards an economy that does not exploit workers, but rather is based off of cooperation and collectivity. Resources are only used in regenerative ways with the free, prior, and informed consent of affected communities for the purpose of ecological and social well-being. Governance is formed through deep democracy, and companies and corporations, as well as public schools and mass media, are held to a standard of care, wellness, and sacredness. This is a regenerative economy of respect, mutuality, and reciprocity. But we also want to draw from some of the examples that we can provide as active community organizers. And one such example has been our partnered work with the Green New Deal Network. As Alaskan community organizers, we know that when we address federal policy or even state policy, it is our task to be translators as well, to take something like the Thrive Agenda, what eventually grew to become the Green New Deal, and indigenize it to make sure that it is accessible in our languages, that it's accessible on our terms, and that it looks like us and reflects us. So the Thrive Agenda was an 8-pillar agenda that delineated all of the aspects of policy that might be implemented to push us towards a just transition with the scope, scale, and standards of what we know we need. It was a $10 trillion plan over 10 years that would move us towards economic equality, justice and liberation for people of color, and ecological harmony and well-being. But in each of these examples, we knew that we needed to make it look like us. So we took these principles and reflected how Indigenous peoples in Alaska, in fact, are already leading in these examples. We held fire chat community listening sessions and allowed our community to take up their own leadership and their own inspiration to see this policy come to life, but also to reflect back so that they would be the determinants of the policy that would claim to be representing them. We, towards this effort, pursue climate education in community-rooted and culturally accessible ways. And so I'll pass to Margie to dive a bit deeper into some of our regenerative economy work and some of the incredible work that's happening across our state.
There are so many people already living into these visions. So it's not something of the distant future, it's happening now. And over the past year, we've, in a crowdsourced way, built a directory of these initiatives that are putting into practice regenerative economic innovations that decrease greenhouse gas emissions and advance equity and justice in ways that center Alaska Native leadership, and really finding ways that generational Indigenous knowledge of this beautiful, beautiful place really means that the Indigenous economies of the past are leading and really just shaping the formation of the regenerative economies of the future. And as a non-Indigenous person who is a grateful guest on these lands, it really helps me find that path towards living in right relationship with the people and place that I call home. So really quickly, just some of the concrete examples across the state that we are excited to uplift. Eva Burke is actually a member of the MIT community now, and she is from Interior Alaska and is doing incredible work on food production and cultural camps to pass on knowledge and language. Alexandra Salmon down in the more southwest part of Alaska in the village of Igiagig is showing how in-stream hydrokinetic turbines can produce electricity and phase out diesel generators, which is awesome. Up in the Northwest, Cyrus Harris in Kotzebue is supporting hunters and bringing traditional foods to elder care facilities and supporting other communities to do that as well. And down in Southeast in Cordova, Dune Lankert, a member of the Eyak tribe, is supporting the emerging ocean kelp farming industry by ensuring that Indigenous communities have their sovereign access to their waterways, and also supporting small business owners with the startup capital needed and support in a regenerative fund to be able to launch this emerging economic sector. And so this all feeds into what we envision for Alaska in the next 10 years, in the next 20, but in 2050, when we're 100% powered by renewable energy, and in 100 years when Alaska Native languages are spoken by everyone here, people are multilingual, young people can pursue higher education in their own culture and language without having to leave, and tribally owned broadband internet means that there's spectrum sovereignty and communities control their airwaves as well. So that's just a snapshot of what we're up to, and I'll pass to Ruth to close us out. Thank you.
And some ways that you can learn even more about all the examples that Margie just shared and plenty more is by staying in touch with us, both on the Just Transition Collective website at justtransitionak.org, as well as exploring the aknexteconomy.com platform to learn more about the regenerative economies work particularly. On both of these websites, you can not only find more information, but more toolkits and educational resources to begin to educate not only on how our Alaska communities are on the front line of the climate and economic crisis, are leading frontline solutions and are prepared to continue being leaders throughout the rest of our movement towards a just transition and a regenerative economy. The second action step that we can recommend is to fund our work. This work is done by a community of nonprofits, often on the labor of Indigenous women. Funding our work is a #1 way to decolonize wealth. And thirdly, decolonize yourself. Look at the resources available on nativemovement.com/resources and take advantage of the trainings there that will soon be available online. There are books, there are podcasts, there are videos, but education for yourself to make sure that you are the best ally you can be and to come into right relationship with our lands is your responsibility. And we are so happy to be able to be here to discuss our work with you. We hope that you stay in touch and enjoy the rest of your summit. Chikinik Khalikidiki.
Thank you so much. We're really happy to hear from Ruth and Margie. And if you didn't notice, I dropped in a Google Doc that they shared into the chat with some additional resources from Native Movement, Fairbanks, the Fairbanks Action or Climate Action Coalition, as well as a few others. So now we are going to hear from Marina Anderson, who was grateful enough to come in person. And who was in town, so she could come here. Marina is the administrator for the organized village of Kasan. She got started in tribal politics initially through her involvement growing up with the Alaska Native Sisterhood, where she learned from elders around her. And at 28 years old, Marina spends the majority of her free time out on the land and the water, harvesting traditional medicines and foods to share with her community. Thank you so much, Marina.
Yiswech Linge Khainach Yuchet Dosak, Yesh Nachat City, Linge Karekina Kajuish Ayachet, Hinyaquan Nachat City, Kaiganayari Ayachet, Mary Bell Di Nanu Egan, Robert Kennedy Di Chinu Egan, James Anderson di Hat U Ijin, Forrest Anderson di Au U Ijang, di Uk Eats Agang, Prince of Wales Islands to Ijing. Basically, I just said hi, and that's our traditional ways of introducing ourselves. I introduced myself in both Tlingit and Khadkil, which is the Haida language. It's important that I introduce myself so that I'm able to acknowledge any of my sisters or brothers that are out there, those that are of the Raven moiety. And it's important that I also acknowledge the eagles that are out there and thank the eagles for holding us up in balance. My traditional introduction actually kind of is a segue into what the Sustainable Southeast Partnership is and how the Sustainable Southeast Partnership operates, because it operates off of our traditional values in Southeast Alaska. Our traditional values, we are a people of balance, we're a people of reciprocity, and we operate by witnessing each other, and we operate by caretaking and repayment. And what that means is when something goes missing in an area, we repay it, and then we wait until somebody can repay us back. And so we're constantly taking care of each other and making sure that all needs are always met. The Sustainable Southeast Partnership is a collective impact network, and it's a beautiful network in Southeast Alaska that is composed of different tribes, Native corporations, local professionals in the energy industry, the food security specialists, local entrepreneurs, artists, and people that are just curious and passionate about local sustainability. The Sustainable Southeast Partnership is a partnership that's been operating in Southeast Alaska for about a decade now, and I've been on the steering committee for about half of its life and involved for the entirety of it so far. It's really interesting because when the Sustainable Southeast Partnership was formed, we created it based on values that were agreed to by the partners. And our core partners have always included tribal governments. And that is really important because, as we heard from Ruth earlier, the colonization and destruction for our people is recent. It's something that my father's generation had to endure and my grandmother's generation had to endure. My great-grandmother had 13 siblings and 2 of them made it out of the boarding school era, and none of them made it out with our language. We're at a place now where we have 1 fluent speaker in our language. That's a first language speaker, and we are starting to regrow who we are as a people and share that in the broader community in Southeast Alaska. I wanted to share the values that we operate off of because these values are what keep the Sustainable Southeast Partnership model really moving forward. Our values are all based off of our traditional values, and they include relationships first. And so we can't operate and we can't create a localized sustainable economy without having true relationships. And to be able to have those true relationships, we do what's called operating at the speed of trust. We cannot move forward on projects and we can't partner with each other unless we have ultimate trust with each other. And to be able to have that trust, we have to be able to have open conversations that are sometimes contentious, but we have to be able to walk out as partners at the end of the day. And with that, the next value that we operate with is balance. Cultural, ecological, and economic well-being is one of the most important things to our collective impact network because it's similar to our mind, body, and spirit within the person, but this is on a broader scale with the entire community of Southeast Alaska. And then third is tribal sovereignty and community determination. We're very supportive of tribal sovereignty, which can be tough to navigate because we have multiple tribes in Southeast Alaska and we respect the sovereignty of each one of those tribes. So there might be opposing views, but we're still able to find areas where we can collaborate and move forward, even when there's those opposing views, and still support the sovereignty of each tribe and support the community determination. That for us is extremely important because communities know what communities need to be able to sustain ourselves. We cannot be waiting for people from the outside world to come in and share with us how to sustain ourselves, because that's exactly what colonization was, right? That's other people coming in and thinking that they're going to fix us, when oftentimes nothing needs to be fixed. Things just need to be transitioned a little bit, and the community knows what that transition looks like. The next value that we operate off of is, we call it stop, observe, and examine. Before we move forward with any projects, we stop. We observe the projects together and we examine and make sure that it's actually something that is going to really be able to sustain itself, and not be a 1 or 2 year program, but something that we're going to see in 50 years, or hopefully in 50 years, we might not need the project anymore because the solution has already been met. Next is intentional collaboration, which is one of my favorite values that we have with the partnership. The method behind intentional collaboration is to make sure to partner up our resources with each other and find what resources we need and find what resources we don't need, so that we're not extracting too much and we're not taking too much time or value from other projects, and we can actually focus in the necessary resources into one project and make sure that it's fruitful. Courage and follow through is another one of our values that we operate off of. Something that you hear very commonly where I'm from is Iwayakuan, which means to be of good courage. Being of good courage means to have good and positive intention, and to know that you're going to fulfill what you're doing and do it in a good way. Next, we have growth and collective learning, and this is especially important when you go to communities that have what we call low capacity or a low level of Western education, because we're able to actually take our partners from around Southeast Alaska, we're able to take their strengths and inject that into the communities. So we might not have people with degrees in the communities, but they have the knowledge that many degree holders have, because they're spending the time growing with each other and retaining that knowledge and doing some localized capacity building. Systems thinking is the next value that we operate with. And it might be one of the most important values, because what that means is that we're actually addressing the roots of problems or issues and not just the symptoms. So for example, when it comes to, there's many things, localized food or food security issues, we're not shipping in a bunch of commodities and food to distribute it to the communities. We're actually figuring out how to localize our food, how to either have gardens and greenhouses, or rely more on traditional foods in the economy. And then last is justice and healing. And this is one of the values that we can't operate without, because as I've said before, and Ruth spoke on earlier, colonization is new to us. It's very recent to us, and it's something that we're still healing from today. And it's not just our Indigenous people that are healing from it, it's the non-Indigenous people as well that are learning how to navigate this world that's been heavily impacted by colonization. And so without that collective justice and that collective healing, we're not able to properly move forward in any of the work that we do, because we won't have trust. And to be able to move forward, we have to operate at that speed of trust. With a Sustainable Southeast Partnership, it's incredible because we focus a lot on what each community needs, as I said earlier, and it looks different for each community. Some communities are focusing more on enhancing the Western economy, and some communities are focusing more on enhancing the traditional economy, and some communities are wanting to actually build up a little bit more of both. When I say the Western economy and when I say the traditional economy, They're two different things, but they actually can work in tandem with each other. The Western economy is based on a monetary value. The traditional economy is actually more tangible and direct. For example, I can have a transaction at a store, bring cash into the store, and walk out with some fruit and basic necessities for my family in the Western economy. In the traditional economy, I'm a fisherman, and so I catch fish. I process thousands of fish every year. And if I have somebody who is a basket weaver or a deer hunter, I can then trade that fish for baskets or for deer and be able to actually have tangible things that I can bring into my home and that they can bring into their home, and they can then trade up. It's a system based off of trade, but it's also a system that is heavily reliant on our environment being intact, our environment being healthy, and our people having the knowledge to find those resources and properly harvest them and properly share them. Our local economy, it depends heavily on the watersheds, and which means our lands and our waters have to be clean and they have to be healthy. It's not just the Western economy that depends on that, and it's not just the traditional economy that depends on that, but it's both of them. Without having intact old growth forests in Southeast Alaska, without having low acidity in our oceans, then we don't have the salmon flowing, and the salmon is the backbone of both economies actually, because we have the commercial fishing industry, we have the charter fishing industry, we have the tourists that like to visit, but then we also have this indigenous economy that completely relies on it. And as indigenous people, it's not that we have the taste buds for the foods that we eat, it's that our DNA actually requires it for us to stay healthy as peoples. And without indigenous peoples being healthy in our places, we are not able to properly steward the land, and therefore it actually hurts the Western economy and it starts to collapse around us. And that's something that the Sustainable Southeast Partnership has recognized, is the need for not relying on indigenous knowledge, but understanding indigenous knowledge and making room for it and respecting indigenous knowledge and integrating it with the Western knowledge that we're learning about today. The Sustainable Southeast Partnership is a growing collective impact network. About 5 years ago, we had most of our catalysts worked in areas such as energy and localized food security. And now we're reaching out to look into mental health and other areas. We're bringing youth into the conversation, knowing that youth are going to be the next generations. And we're expanding our network, not just in Southeast Alaska, but we're actually starting to share our methods with others who border us and others around the world who are interested in learning about our collective impact network. So that's, yeah, the SSP.
Cool. Thanks so much, Marina.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Marina, for everything you shared with us and for being here. Next, we have Michel Gelobter. He's a co-founder of the Green Leadership Trust, a coalition of the people of color and indigenous board members of US environmental organizations. He's the managing director of the nonprofit Reflective Earth, chairman of Cooler Inc., the climate change API, and the author of Lean's Startup for Social Change, the revolutionary path to big impact. Michel co-authored the first reports on how climate change disproportionately impact communities of color in the US and around the world.
Hi, should I start? Thank you. I'm on, right? Okay, hi everybody. Thank you very much for that welcome, and an honor to follow the prior speaker. I just wanted to, and congratulations on such an amazing conference today. I really honored to speak here, but also really grateful for your topic. In thinking about, I guess I want to speak a little bit about a long-term view on climate justice, and I want to sort of talk about two dimensions of the climate justice perspective that I've been working on, I guess, for a while. I started working on climate justice in 1995. I've been working on climate change since 1985. And I think what's important for, in addition to what the prior speakers have said, I think we want to try to take a perspective. We have to understand that the perspective of climate justice and of communities of color and indigenous communities isn't just one where we need to be protected from or sheltered from impacts, but it's one where the solutions lie within our communities in every way. The economic solutions, the political solutions, and most importantly, the technology and innovation solutions. Native communities have a lot to teach us, for example, about how to live in the world as it's changing and how to keep the world from changing more than we've already messed it up. I want to point people particularly to a book that's been blowing my mind recently called The Dawn of Everything, which is a sort of a big thick tome that came out about 2 months ago by a bunch of anthropologists. And they make the point kind of stunningly that the ideas we have about equality, for example, don't come in the way a lot of philosophers today think from the West and from Westerners. They say, look, why do you think a bunch of white folks in Europe in the 1800s would start writing about liberty and equality when they had lived for, in many cases, 2,000 years under some of the most oppressive totalitarian kingdom regimes that had ever existed? And what was happening around that time? Oh, my goodness. Those same folks were starting to deeply encounter indigenous cultures in Africa and in North America. And it turns out that one of the best-selling books of the whole 19th century, the 18th century, was a series of debates that were held between the French governor of Quebec and the Lahontan chief, in which the Lahontan chief said, I think private property is a source of tremendous evil. You guys have crime and judges and prisons. These are things we don't need. And he really broke down in ways that a lot of young people today are starting to talk about mutual aid. And it was that book that almost everybody who was a philosopher in the 18th century had read that led to people like Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and others writing about inequality, in some sense inventing it in Western culture, because it really hadn't existed there before. So in some very deep ways, I think people are starting to realize how much what we think of as some of the better parts of the West, in fact, come from indigenous folks that Europeans started encountering around the time that they started writing this kind of philosophy. So I want to point people, in terms of your thinking, to go look at some of that new stuff that's coming out from anthropology and other studies that are really showing how much we owe other cultures, and particularly indigenous cultures and African cultures, in terms of how we think about equality and justice in the West. I think really there are sort of two dimensions of climate justice that I think are worth taking a long-term view. One is what we call technically mitigation, why climate justice is so central to stopping emissions and reducing global warming. And the first one really is political, is what I'd say, is that as some of you may have read recently, there's been some study done about 1.5 years ago out of the New School, I think, that showed that about only 1.3% of all climate philanthropy had gone to communities of color up until last year. There's a lot of big grants made this year, sort of as a result of that, but 1.3% of all climate philanthropy had gone to communities of color, right? Ridiculous. It's especially ridiculous because there are no legislators, no local legislators, no state legislators, no federal legislators who vote for climate policy who don't depend on voters of color to win their elected seats. If all your voters are white, you're not voting for climate policy. It's just a reality. So the fact that climate philanthropy and that some of the mainstream environmental movement have failed to understand the political power that our communities have, and to serve and to engage that political power in our efforts to stop global warming is kind of ridiculous. I would say I was on a call with the White House yesterday on delayism, but I would say, and I said on that call, a lot of the rhetoric that Biden uses around environmental justice didn't come from the traditional environmental community. That was not mainstream environmental. As a matter of fact, the main rhetoric that the White House uses around jobs and economic development and environmental justice, whatever your problems are with them, is far in advance of anything any other prior administration have done. But most importantly, it doesn't come out of the mainstream environmental movement. That's not rhetoric that they earned their way into the White House with. That's rhetoric that politicians have picked up, whether it's Keith Ellison in Minnesota or other, who was the first person to say the word environmental justice at the Democratic National Convention, I think in 2012. It comes out of the struggle of grassroots communities, comes out of the struggle of working people to make it clear that climate change is an economic and employment and a political issue for us, and has been forever. We're the core voters, we're the core power really underneath that kind of transformation. So I think probably the most important insight from the perspective of stopping global warming is the political power that we represent. And the Green Leadership Trust is a coalition of board members of color of all the environmental groups in the United States. And our mission across different boards is to build power for our movement, period. And that power, obviously, because we're a BIPOC organization, we believe lies in BIPOC communities, and the electoral force and the organizing force and the innovation forces that we already represent. I think the other thing to think about for climate justice and mitigation is that we have to build new skills in our work on environmental justice. The problem of climate change is somewhat different than the problem we worked on in the early days of the environmental justice movement around toxics and natural resources and things like that. Climate change is much more of in terms of its justice impacts, it still has huge natural resource implications in terms of extincting species, creating forest fires, droughts and things like that. That's clear. But at a social justice level, some of the biggest impacts are also economic and employment impacts. I'm not one who particularly believes that you can cut 80% of emissions as we need to, and that somehow that could happen in a way that would increase toxic emissions from energy facilities. We were worried about that in the early days. There's not a lot of evidence that that's happening. What is happening is that, the Biden administration has had to back away from some of its more aggressive climate plans, has moved to things like tax credits or other measures like that, that if you're not paying taxes because you're low income, you can't benefit from. So the subsidies that are being pushed out from governments, whether it's in California for solar panels or at the federal level for electric vehicles, are not structured in ways that necessarily directly benefit our communities or that our communities can even seriously engage in. So what's really critical from a mitigation perspective, or again, a stopping global warming perspective, is that we tool up our thinking about employment, about economics, about where the clean energy economy is going and how we can participate in it. Van Jones, a good friend and one I'm sure you all know of, helped start the movement on green jobs. The reality is that the proportion of people of color in dirty energy jobs is much higher than it is in clean energy jobs today, meaning people who work in coal-fired power plants, the gasoline industry is much more diverse than the clean energy industry, partially because the pay is actually lower. And we have to ask ourselves, do we really expect to transition from unionized, high-paying jobs in fossil fuel facilities to low-paying sort of piecemeal work in solar and renewable energy and expect to get worker support and community support at lower wages? So we have to understand we need to pay the people involved in the clean energy economy as much, and we need to think about a just transition from an employment perspective for those who are transitioning from dirty energy to clean energy. The other reality is that some of the answers we hope for, the answer that everyone's going to have an electric car, first of all, is potentially an environmental nightmare because it's a hell of a lot of batteries and a hell of a lot of mining and a hell of a lot of locking in of future types of environmental damage. But most importantly, some research, for example, has shown that the cost of stopping global warming in the transportation sector is 80% lower at a global level if you think about shared autonomous vehicles. Right? Most people don't use their cars 93% of the time. Why do we, especially low-income folks who don't have access to great cars or dependable vehicles, want to invest that much capital in something we don't use very much? And if we move instead to understanding transportation as a right and thinking about how we use shared vehicles, how we can create smarter vehicles, we can have less of them, which means the production is less polluting, we have less traffic, more mass transit. Those are the kinds of transitions we need to make: less commuting, less distance between kids and their parents at work, things like that. So those are the kinds of operational medium to long-term things that we have to think about, and how do we design a system that uses less fossil fuels. There's also the concern about adaptation, which is the second big dimension, because we are locking in, a lot of global warming is locked in to the atmosphere today, more than I think people want to acknowledge. And the issue there is, again, where's the intersection with justice? How do we deal with the fact that today we have 80 million climate refugees? The last IPCC, which is the global scientific body that looked at refugee questions, said that we could estimate over 500 million climate refugees by the end of the 21st century. And that was before a new study doubled the amount of land that would be flooded from global warming, that study came out about 2 years ago. I haven't seen newer estimates, but the number of climate refugees is going to be truly horrific. The issues of displacement, of displaced livelihoods in local communities and indigenous communities, the shifting of ecosystems faster than people can keep up with them, are really, really hazardous, really, really scary. The challenge, I think, the opportunity rather for climate justice is to understand that as difficult as these transitions will be, they are all possible with the right kind of political and social will. One example, I'm a New Yorker. It broke my heart when Hurricane Sandy took the subway system down. I think privately, a lot of people would say that it's not clear that the New York City subway system is going to last through the next 30 or 40 years of climate change. If we were to have two Hurricane Sandys in a decade, it would be seriously marginalized. You ask yourself, how are we going to pay to transition a system that so many people depend on for their livelihoods? That's so much money to do that. And an insight I got from some of the folks who came over from Holland, which has been dealing with being underwater for like 8 centuries now, and they came over to the New York region to help think about resilience for a couple of years. And their insight was really that that really all it's required is to shift your investment perspective from one of kind of rampant real estate flipping, 2 to 4 year, I bought a piece of property, I flipped it and made money, to a more human and social capital perspective on infrastructure investment. And so when you think of, if let's say New York City were to start building really innovative surface transportation systems, if cities that were at risk from flooding were to start building elevated housing on stilts, if we were to start to reshape our land in ways that allowed us to adapt to what we know is coming before the disasters happen, these would become attractions. They would become interesting. They'd become sources of innovation. People would go, oh, wow, did you see what New York is doing to make itself climate proof? Did you see how New Orleans is changing architectural standards, or other cities that are on the coast are changing their housing to be flexible and to be resilient? The Dutch folks I know pointed out to me that the Dutch have been managing 80% of waterborne traffic in Europe since the 12th century. 80% of waterborne traffic in Europe since the 12th century. When you have a problem, you're a country that's underwater, you turn it into an asset. And if we can just get ourselves out of sort of rampant, disempowering market systems and into ones that help understand how we have to build the human capital to adapt, we're also all going to be a lot better off. Finally, I'll just close by saying one of the things I use to guide my work is to just refuse to own the problem. The political battle to beat global warming is going to be difficult, and people engaged in that political battle, it's going to be a lot of hard work. But the world we're headed towards will be so much better than the world we're in today. You think about the war in Iraq, which at this point clocked in at $7 trillion. We could have used that money to stop global warming pretty much cold. You look at what's happening in Ukraine today, where maybe the price in oil, the spike in the oil price might well have paid Putin's government for the invasion of Ukraine. Most of the time, I think that anything Putin is doing is basically meant to keep the price of oil up, because people are using less and less oil, in fact, if they're not in crisis. And the price of oil is plummeting without artificial wars and other things to jack it back up. So just in all the work we do, talking about things being hard isn't productive, and it's also not true. We're spending trillions of dollars. People are losing their lives from pollution from fossil fuel. People are commuting ungodly distances in America today, pandemic notwithstanding. We've done a lot of research on just how much more people spend away from their families in the last 50 years than they did in the 50 years before the fossil fuel economy really took over. So we're headed in a climate change friendly world, in a world that accepts our limits and powers our self-sustainability to a much better place, with less war, with more time in our communities, with less time in cars and less pollution, and more stable ecosystems eventually, if we can get this rampant emission stuff under control. So I would say, just keep in mind, always try to think through not so much the guilt that you feel, or not so much the trouble that you're fighting, but try to frame things and try to, you usually, to do this work, we all have to have positive visions, and to help communicate that to folks, the better place we're going as we get ourselves unhooked from these addictions to fossil fuels that have caused us so much trouble. Thanks.
So much, Michael. And I think one thing that you really just said there highlighted kind of brought us a little bit full circle into how we started the day and to where we are kind of in the world, and understanding that, what happens in one arena, whether it's in militarily, economically, socially, politically, it's all part of the same system. So thank you so much for bringing that in. Now I'll let Raul introduce our final speaker.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Our final speaker of the day is Colette Pichon. Colette is a generational native of Bayou Liberty, Louisiana. As founder and executive director of the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, she develops programming focused on equitable disaster recovery, global migration, community economic development, climate justice, and energy democracy. Colette worked with local communities, national founders, and elected officials in the post-Katrina and post-Deepwater Horizon disaster recovery. She will talk about protecting frontal communities of color and establishing a new climate agenda.
Thank you so much, Raul and Austin. And I offer also my gratitude for the great work of this conference. And thank you to MIT and to my fellow presenters. This has been a really great session and I've learned so much already. My name is Colette Pichon. I want to offer my greetings and peace to the Choctaw Nation, from which I normally give my conversations. That's the place where I live in Southeast Louisiana. I offer my peace to the Lenape people, who are the traditional landholders in Pennsylvania, where I'm calling in from today. And I want to offer my thanks to all of the conference organizers who've invited so many wonderful frontline speakers into this conversation. I think this is a great change, and I'm excited to be a part of it. I'm the co-executive director of the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, as Raul said. We are headquartered in the great state of Louisiana, and we work across 5 Gulf South states: Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. And we also work in the colonized territory of Puerto Rico. And I'm excited to say that we'll be moving upward with our organizational work to a national and global level this year in 2022. I want to talk a little bit about the reality of South Louisiana. We just heard from our previous speaker, lots of references to New Orleans and to how things are changing and have changed there. And for many of you who are hearing the sound of my voice, you may not be old enough to remember that in 2005, there was a very large storm called Hurricane Katrina, which hit the Gulf Coast and did not just take out the great city of New Orleans, but it went across 3 states, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, and wreaked havoc across all 3 of those states and the whole entire Gulf Coast when it came ashore. And this was an eye-opening moment, a canary in the coal mine, a warning shot, if you will, for all of the storms that have come since Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And I offer my peace and my love to the survivors of Hurricanes Harvey, Hurricanes Maria, all of the hurricanes that have come on our shores since then. What we have seen in South Louisiana is absolutely an increase in intensity in storms. And this increased intensity is being caused by rising temperatures, not only in our atmosphere and in our air, but in our oceans. And the ocean temperatures are what give rise to stronger storms. So if it's hotter on the planet, the oceans absorb most of the heat. If the oceans are hotter, the storms are stronger. If the storms are stronger, they create themselves quicker, they move faster, and they do way more damage than just the normal cycle of tropical storms that my people have become accustomed to over hundreds of years, thousands of years, but are now coming at an intensity that no one can anticipate and even really prepare for. And so many of our brothers and sisters cannot survive. There are other realities of South Louisiana that you should know about. We lose about a football field of land every 45 minutes in South Louisiana. This is due to sea level rise. The seas are actually coming up. And in addition, the land loss is so fast and rapid in South Louisiana because on top of sea level rise that is caused by global warming, we are still dealing and contending with the oil and gas industry whose infrastructure takes out our natural systems, our natural marshes, our wetlands that help to keep the land in place. Pipelines, shipping channels actually allow for saltwater intrusion and take out our natural barriers and then progress the land loss in a much more rapid pace. And so we're losing land at one of the fastest rates on the planet in South Louisiana. And I offer my peace and love to those in island nations across the globe who are losing their land and are having to move their people already because sea level rise and the combination of sea level rise with industry is causing many of our populations to move. Louisiana was one of the first states in the United States to receive federal funding to relocate some of its people because of climate change. And this has been a very tense process, just full of challenges, both because the folks who are being moved first are indigenous peoples who are inhabiting the bottom pieces, the bottom parishes of South Louisiana, but also because we're dealing with a sort of piloting or experimentation of people's land and people's culture and people's identity. And we're trying to put it inside of systems that really are just made to provide at best units of housing or units of progress without taking into consideration the deep trauma, harm, and loss that comes with relocation. In addition to these storms, relocation, land loss, we're dealing with rising temperatures in South Louisiana, but across the South and across the United States, temperatures in the last 10 years have been the hottest on record. The only year outside of the last 10 years that reaches these records was in 2005, which was the year Hurricane Katrina made landfall. And that is when the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy began itself. We started in the aftermath of disaster. We've been dealing with and understanding not just disaster response and recovery, but really starting to look to what's causing these disasters, what's accelerating them, and what's putting our people, our ecology, our economy at so much harm. And so I just want to offer that we're seeing all of the changes here in the United States. We're seeing all of the impacts here in our great state of Louisiana. We're seeing all of the impacts that are being talked about globally and being addressed globally. We're seeing them in the United States, but to my sadness, the leadership, the politicians, the decision makers don't want to understand the impact on communities, but instead focus solely on the impact of invisible atmospheric reductions that can be changed with the punch of a keyboard in order to show some progress. I'm talking about a fixation on simply reducing CO2 emissions as opposed to really getting to the root cause of the problem and addressing the root cause. The topic of this conversation is how do we embrace this just transition from an extractive economy to a regenerative one? And I'll just offer that in order for us to embrace anything, we're going to have to put down everything we have in our privileged American arms before we can embrace anything new. And what do we have in our arms? Well, I think we have dirty energy in our arms, structural racism in our arms, gender bias, nationalist superiority, and individualism. These are the things that most of us grow up with, not even meaning to be harmful, not meaning to do any damage or ill will. Most of us are socialized into a country and into a level of privilege that allows us to look past the harm that we cause every day to communities inside of our nation and communities all around the planet. It is what we hold in our arms that we must put down before we can embrace a new transition. To acquire any of these changes, anything new, we're going to have to put down these things. And that means we're going to have to examine why we have these items in our arms in the first place. I believe in our minds, we have been overcome with fear. And we've been overcome with fear instead of allowing notions of love to really take set in our mind. I know this sounds like it's not part of this economic conversation, but it is fear that is driving our need to consume. It is fear that is driving our need to invade and oppress. It is fear that is driving all of these harmful things that have repercussions both on the economy and in these energy systems that we hold so dear. And this is what we're going to have to change. We're going to have to change the state of our minds so that they are not just led with fear. And in our hearts, in order for us to move the way we do and have in our arms what we have, our hearts must have been seduced by notions of self and individualism. And this seduction is happening instead of us embracing the power of the collective. So we have to deal with the seduction that is in our hearts around what we are making choices around, what we can do by ourselves, how much we can contribute to a particular issue, problem, or solution. And this is not the right approach. And we must put this down. We must put this seduction down and actually move back into a state of understanding that our humanity is a collective humanity on one planet Earth. And all of these divisions that have been given to us, right down to the ones we give ourselves, are man-made, unreal, artificial, and have no consequence if we do not have a planet to live on. And third, I believe that our souls have been overrun by the harmful act of taking, and we have forgotten about the reparative act of giving, and we must change this in our souls before we are able to make any type of transition. I recognize that this is new to some people. This is a new way of thinking about a just transition and a new economy. But if we do not change our minds, our hearts, and our souls, we will never get to the root cause of the problem, and we will never understand the role that we play in a global consumption pattern that is causing imbalance around the planet. It's important for us to understand that as Americans, we consume almost 24% of the global energy. 24% of the global energy use is by Americans, while Americans only make up 5% of the global population. We are disproportionately, because of our privilege, because of our power, because of our access, we are contributing a large percentage of what is happening to the planet. We are contributing to this just from the basis of us being ourselves, consuming the way we consume, moving the way we move with that mind of individualism and with our hearts full of fear and our souls really out for the taking. And we're going to have to embrace something new if we're going to get to a just transition. In order to embrace a just transition, we're going to have to begin with a deep and concentrated work on ourselves and on our communities. I cannot tell you how many people have shown up in Black communities and poor communities to help the poor victims of the system or of a particular action, when really what we need from our allies, especially those who are not coming out of oppressed situations, is for you to take the time to look at how you are contributing to the system and how your community can help to change the system toward human dignity, human rights, and the rights of nature. I offer the HIMES principles as a guiding post for most of you. And if you haven't heard of this, these principles are really used for democratic organizing, but there's one principle in particular, and it says you must have a commitment to self-transformation, which means you must have the courage to acknowledge that perhaps what you have learned, perhaps how you live, perhaps the way you think about what the problem is incorrect. And I want to offer to you that much of what we have learned in our very well-intended school systems are incorrect, inaccurate, and rooted and leaning toward the oppressor. We have to release these attitudes of charity of the victim, charity toward the victim, helping those over there who can't seem to help themselves, into an understanding that victimization is usually caused and vulnerability is usually scripted. It is often created by targeting of particular communities and particular laws and strategies of marginalizing communities. And then we have some kind of nerve to tell those folks that they have made poor individual choices. This is not what is happening. We are in a system that is structurally racist and discriminatory. This is not about you being racist. This is not about any individual guilt. This is about us having the courage to acknowledge that the foundation that the system is built on is flawed. That's all we have to go to. It is time to dismantle the flawed system and recreate a new one, and one that allows for the dignity and human rights and ecological equity of all people and beings on the planet. It's not just a good idea, it's what we're going to need to survive. We have to understand that the imbalance we see in the planet today is because of the access to a concept of wealth that is devoid of health, devoid of life, and devoid of freedom for the majority of the people. We have to understand wealth not as money and monetary gain, but as people's access to a good and healthy life, people's access to life itself, and people's access to dignity and liberty. We cannot allow for the wealth gap to be the deciding factor of who will survive the climate crisis. We must address the economic imbalance that we see in this nation and that we see globally. We have exported a racialized capitalism that is now impacting the world and impacting our planet and our ability to remain here as humans. This is not just rhetoric. We are now facing extinction as a human race. And if you do not understand the climate crisis as the issue that you must turn your attention toward, you do not understand what is happening right outside your door every day. Check your temperatures, check your weather patterns, check all of these things, and don't be confused. This is not about one day. This is about all the days. This is not about one season. This is about seasons over a length of time. We are seeing massive change in our atmosphere. We are seeing massive change in our nature and our ecological systems. This threatens our water. This threatens our food. This threatens our health. This threatens our ability to live dignified lives as humans. It is on the line now because the climate crisis is what we all have to turn our attention to. And before we can move, before we can transition, before we can understand what it is to have a regenerative economy, we're going to have to do the hard and deep spiritual work that requires you and me to reconnect to a deep part of yourself that understands things have value even when they don't have any commodified value to you. There are people who deserve to exist. There are ecological systems that deserve to exist. There is water that deserves to exist without being polluted or used by industry, because they have an inherent right to exist, whether or not you find commodified value in them at all. This revaluation is going to require you to understand that money is not what's going to save us. It is the knowledge of our indigenous brothers and sisters around the globe, the people who know how to survive, the traditions that keep us in balance with nature and with this planet that will help us survive. If you are seduced by these technological advances that have no proof, no basis, and no right to take precedent over investment in people, front lines, and infrastructure that will protect us from this climate crisis and shifts in our economy that will stop the acceleration of it, then you have misunderstood the opportunity of the moment. This is not an opportunity for you to make money. This is an opportunity for us to change our social and moral standard to one that allows dignity and justice for everyone. Before we can make it to that regenerative economy, we must understand the inherent value of people and ecology to exist, whether it has commodified value to you at all. And when the value is assigned, we must understand that life-giving forces are what we must hold highest. We should be protecting our water. We should be protecting our land. We should be protecting those trees in the Amazon. We should be fighting for every single river that flows. And we should make sure that these things are clean, healthy, and available to everyone. We should resist privatization of all of our natural resources. And we should require those who have extracted common property, including oil and gas and coal, to pay what is necessary for our communities to become resilient in the face of what is coming. And for those of us in South Louisiana and so many places around the globe that is already here. We must choose now. We must choose now to make these changes. We must choose now to make these shifts. We must choose a transition, and then we must go toward transformation. After we engage in the transition, we must continue until we are fully transformed, and this will require us to reimagine a life that we can live together as humans on this planet. We must reimagine borders. We must reimagine gender. We must reimagine wealth. We must reimagine all of these constructs that have been put on us and then told to us that we must uphold them for the benefit of a few. We must reimagine this. We must repair all of the harm that has been done from this country to around the globe, from colonization until the futures that we are hoping that will come and be full for the people who are coming after us. We must repair the harm that has been done, and then we must restore everyone's right to live a dignified and valuable life. That means access to health, access to life, access to dignity. It must be restored. And all of this is what many of my colleagues have already said. We must re-indigenize ourselves, not just in that exotification process to where you think you find your indigenous DNA, although ashe and love to all of the indigenous leaders around the world who know who they are and who have retained their cultural knowledge. We respect, we honor, and we follow you. But this is also about those of us who do not know where we come from, who do not know from whom we have derived our lives and our bloodline from. It is time for you to understand who you are and what you bring to the table. We need everybody's solutions on the table now. And to re-indigenize yourself is to honor who you are and where you come from, and to bring the strongest pieces of what you have to offer to the table, to the collective table, for us to move together. When we move together, we must follow the front lines. We must follow those who have been marginalized, targeted, and devalued, but who remain and survive, who understand and know, and who have the ability to teach us how to love and reconnect to Mother Earth. This is not a drill. This is real. This is where we are. And a just transition is not just about a market solution to our extractive economy. We must challenge this economic system of racialized capitalism, and we must understand that we will not get to a solution where what is at the top of the mark is profit. We will only get to a solution when we center and elevate and prioritize the earth and her people. Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to meeting all of you on the front lines. We will join hands, we will win, and we have to choose now to make these changes. Thank you.